Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Richards, Technical Services Manager of the Managing General Agents Association. And on behalf of the MGAA, I'd like to welcome you to our briefing this afternoon. This is being delivered by Zing 365 on the subject of ESG, what you need to know. Before I introduce our presenter, I'd just like to run through a few housekeeping points. Please ensure your microphone and camera are turned off. If you'd like to ask a question, feel free to use the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Time allowing, these questions will be asked and answered at the end of the session. If we run out of time, questions will be answered after the event. This presentation is accredited for CII CPD accreditation quality if relevant to your ongoing professional development programme. The briefing is being recorded and a link to the recording will be issued post-event, together with the slides and our feedback survey. Please take the time to complete our survey. It takes no longer than 2 minutes and allows us to continue to deliver the best possible future events to our members. So to recap, today's briefing is on the subject of ESG, what you need to know from Zing 365. So let me introduce you to our presenter, Carousel. With over a decade's experience in highly regulated environments, including general insurance and the not-for-profit conservation sector, Caris has honed a unique expertise in compliance roles. Her passion lies in demystifying complex topics, transforming them into practical and easily digestible training sessions. Her dedication to clear communication ensures that even most intricate regulations are accessible to all, fostering understanding and compliance across diverse teams. Caris is committed to creating impactful, simplified learning experiences that empower individuals and organisations to navigate regulatory landscapes with confidence and ease. So without further ado, enjoy the briefing, everyone, and Caris, over to you.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. Yes, so as said, we are looking at the very hot topic of ESG today. So looking at that sort of top level, what is it you need to know? So we're going to understand what ESG is, what it means for business, and also importantly, actually, the unique relationship that it has with the insurance industry. So moving on, this is kindly have been read out to you, so I'll move on to the objectives here. So by the end of this session, you will be able to explain what ESG is. You're also going to have an understanding of how it has evolved, so turned into what it is we know and understand it as today. You're also going to be able to identify and describe those key ESG factors and concepts. Also explain why ESG is important for business, so why it's being spoken about so much, and also be able to summarise the relationship that ESG has with the insurance industry. And it's often described as a unique relationship, and we'll understand why that is as we go through this session. So of course, starting at the very top then, what on earth is ESG? What are we talking about? Now, it is a hot topic acronym and it stands for Environmental, Social and Governance. Now, ESG is a data-led initiative that sets standards for how businesses operate regarding the planet and its people. Now, it was initially developed by and for investors. It works as an indicator for a company's level of responsibility and resilience for the issues and risks that fall into the categories of the E, S and G. But it's kind of evolved to become a tool for business. So it's influencing corporate strategy, it's influencing ways of working, all through that lens of environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and also those ethical business practices. And it's often now sort of being used as an interchangeable term with sustainability. But we need to understand that they are not the exact same thing, even if they are sort of terms that are being used interchangeably and together. Now, they are intrinsically linked. Excuse me, sorry, let me grab a quick drink. Got a little tickle, that's not good for anybody, right? So they are intrinsically linked, but they are not the same thing, and it's worth understanding. So sustainability is a broader concept. The whole aim is to cover our present needs without compromising the resources for future generations. Sustainability is an ideology, but it can be put into practice. And this is done in a number of different ways. This in front of you now is a stereotypical sustainable business model, and it tends to take this form. So it's the environment, society and economy. They're the three main pillars of it. You may even hear it come across as the 3 Ps or the triple bottom line. So that's planet, people and profit. Now, this takes a broader societal view, and these models are often considered to either be philanthropic, causal, or maybe even impact-led. When it comes to ESG, this is much more about strategy. ESG is strategic. It involves combining the environmental, social, and governance factors in a company's operations to reduce risks, but to seize opportunities. And then policies and procedures are developed to actually support this. So it does incorporate sustainability, but it's through more of that reporting lens, through that data-led lens within a company's operations. So it's all about firms creating effective strategies to address these challenges and unlock the strategic value. So it's not about completely converting to the sustainable model or restarting the business as that. It's about pulling ESG and sustainability actually into the wider strategy of the business. So it doesn't sit alongside the rest of the strategy or strategic objectives. It actually permeates through them. So ESG as a term is something we're hearing more and more. In the last couple of years, it's had a lot more traction. Probably the last 5 years, we've heard about it a lot more than we ever have before. But it's not a completely new idea. It's a new way of looking at things and turning it into that data-led initiative. So very quick history lesson on how we got to where we are today. We're going back to the 1960s. This is where socially responsible investing first really emerged. Investors were avoiding certain stocks, even entire industries, for ethical reasons, seeking out more socially responsible opportunities. So a real example here was the move away from tobacco companies at the time. Also in the UK, electrical and mine worker unions started investing their pension capital into things like affordable housing and health facilities. So really looking through that socially responsible lens. Going forward a couple of decades, we hit 1987. The Brundtland Report is a key study and report in this area. It's also known as Our Common Future. It was produced by the World Commission on Environment and Development, and it's all about advocating sustainable development. So the real emphasis of this report is that economic growth can actually coexist with environmental preservation. It doesn't have to be at the detriment of the environment. And it's considered to be where we actually get our understanding of the term sustainability from. Moving ahead to the millennium, we had the United Nations Global Compact. Now, this urged companies to align with principles based around human rights, labour, the environment, as well as anti-corruption, and it has around 13,000 company signatories across 160 countries. Just 4 years later, the foundations of ESG principles as we know them today were laid down by the former UN Secretary General, Kofi Annan. He engaged with over 50 CEOs of major financial institutions, all about promoting this sustainability within businesses. And just a year later, the term ESG was actually coined for the very first time in a landmark study called Who Cares Wins. And this offered a lot of guidance on integrating that environmental, social and governance factors into a business's operations. And then, of course, we've got the Paris Agreement, a massive element, particularly when it comes to climate change. This was brought to life with nations pledging to keep global temperatures to below that 2 degrees above industrial levels. At the time, they said it would be nice if we could aim for that 1.5 degrees, but actually, due to the science, that goalpost changed, and we actually should be making sure we're not breaching the 1.5. And those of you that sort of keep in line with this type of news, we did actually hit the 1.5 last year. So really making sure we try our hardest to try not to breach this area. On this year as well, another massive event in this space was the Sustainable Development Goals were established, the SDGs, by the United Nations General Assembly, and they are 17 goals for a better future for people and the planet, and often actually used by businesses as part of their ESG framework. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour of how ESG has come to be and why we're speaking about it today. Now, as we touched on, the E, S and G are environmental, social and governance. They are the 3 pillars within an ESG framework, and they offer us a way of collectively grouping key factors of non-financial risks and opportunities for a business. So you can use bear with me, you can use the chat function for this if you'd like to respond to this question, or just think where you're sat right now. What factors do you think fall within the environmental element? Now, these are all the factors that focus on a business's impact on the natural world, and also vice versa. So the impact of the natural world, the climate, etc., on a business itself. So this includes things like our resource use, climate change, of course, a big one in this area, pollution, biodiversity, and unfortunately the nature crises that is also going hand in hand with the climate crisis and is only actually sort of getting the similar level of recognition. Now, climate change does dominate this space, and that's purely because it's posing that significant global challenge. It's got real life implication to actually impact our lives, our resources, and then of course that's got knock-on effects to our economies and our businesses. So ESG actually requires businesses to shift from being part of the problem to becoming part of the solution when it comes to the environmental elements. When we're talking about those social factors, or the S factor, these are all of the factors that relate to people in and around a business. It's about promoting ethics, it's about fighting discrimination, and it's all looking for that fair treatment of individuals. So there's an emphasis on a diverse and inclusive and worker-centric environment, the priority of staff development as well as well-being. It's about advocating for human rights and labour rights and just the positive treatment of all individuals. And it's also reflective of those both internal and external to the business. So this includes things like our interaction with the communities in which we operate, and actually seeing if the business does contribute positively to the communities, again, in which they are based, in which they are operating. And finally, we've got the G, which of course is an area that we know and love, and this incorporates things like those sort of traditional governance elements that we would think of, our AML, our ABC, but it also goes a bit beyond this towards those corporate board structures, sustainability oversight, general compliance, as well as things that may be a bit more of a taboo topic, so executive compensation, our tax strategies, all of these things come into play here as well. So ESG covers a massively broad range of factors and standards. And it's worth noting that businesses are not expected to have an answer or an action for every single one of them. If we did, we wouldn't get our day jobs done at all. Instead, it's about focusing on areas that actually matter to the business, to the industry, so say there could be mandated regulation, and also to stakeholders. And stakeholders are a group in particular that we're going to look at as we proceed today. Now, it's really worth emphasising that even though ESG breaks down those risks and opportunities into those three pillars, they do not work in isolation. Progress cannot be made in one area without requiring the input and involvement of another. And a really good example of this is when businesses are setting their net zero targets. So a firm cannot hit those targets if they don't transition their operations, which requires the buy-in and involvement of all of their stakeholders, and have the necessary processes, the systems and the controls in place to actually support and govern those changes that are being made. Now, it's also worth noting that we may even find that we have some improvement in one area, say within the E, we're looking at climate change, our net zero goals. This could actually have a negative impact on another area, say our social area. And a really good example of this is electric vehicles. Now, of course, we're pushing for these more than petrol or diesel cars. They're considered the greener alternative. But if we think about them, the mining for precious metals, those components for their batteries, brings with it things like labour risks. There are human rights considerations in the areas that these precious metals are being found from. There's also the opportunity for pollution from groundwater from the actual mining of these metals. So the point I'm making here is that there may also actually have to be trade-offs. There may also have to be compromises made by a firm when they're actually looking at their strategy. So that's what I mean by it's about what's most important to the firm. Where can they make the biggest sort of impact, and how is that relevant to their business? How is that important to their stakeholders? So it's just worth bearing in mind that we don't want that siloed thinking. We do need to consider these different elements. Now, as we saw, this is something that's been spoken about for decades, sustainability in particular. ESG is sort of the new kid on the block when it comes to this, being that data-led initiative instead. So why is it that this is really dominating this space now? Why are we hearing about it so much? Why are we talking about it so much? Now, there are a myriad of reasons. I've summed these up in 3 for the purposes of today's 1-hour session. First up, we've got extreme events. We are living through a number of extreme events. This includes things like our extreme weather and pollution. So climate change related weather events are becoming more frequent and severe. We're finding there's a lot of data showing that also the losses from those events are increasing. Pollution is now more visible than it ever has been before. If we're thinking about those images of plastics in the ocean, sewage and wastewaters being put in our water systems. If you've ever seen the map of sort of the British water systems and how much wastewater and sewage is actually legally allowed to be pumped in them, it will make you want to never step foot in a river again. And it's difficult to ignore the effects of these environmentally irresponsible practices. The global pandemic also comes into play here. We're still talking about it because it really highlighted a number of collective issues. It highlighted access to healthcare. It highlighted issues that come with supply. And also it highlighted those alternatives to business as usual. So for example, that move sort of to remote and hybrid, it's things that we thought we would never see happening. So businesses are already starting to change their business models. We've also got the cost of living crisis really continuing to impact financial resilience, for example. We're also living through a number of geopolitical events. And to just pull one out, we've got the war in Ukraine. If we think about all of those sanctions that were put on Russia, for example, this has raised issues about the dependence on fossil fuels. So it's already an environmental concern. This highlighted the energy security as being a priority, as being a concern also. Next, we've got that growing awareness. We've got growing activism. If we think about people like Greta Thunberg, we've got Just Stop Oil really sort of dominating activism in the environmental space. We've also got social rights movements. We're living through a number of these. We've got things like the Me Too movement is still ongoing. Black Lives Matter, Trans Lives Matter. Really a lot of movement carrying on. There's a lot of sort of political polarization around these elements as well, which pulls in social media. This is now our number one source for crowd influence and news, is social media. And we are exposed to these things more than ever before, be it factually correct or not. We're seeing images of environmental crisis. We're seeing images of catastrophes, human rights violations, sort of in real time in some instances as they're actually happening. And things like sustainability related campaigns, they're gaining significant traction when it comes to those social media platforms. So we've really got increased awareness in this space. Another reason for the growing focus is there is a lot of technological advancement and rapid innovation currently happening. We're living through a time that there's actual viable alternatives to some of the problems that have been spoken about for a long time. So renewable energy becoming sort of more accessible, more readily available. Going back to those electric vehicles, we've got a number of those, or hybrids, now readily available for individuals to buy. Brilliant minds are coming up with incredible solutions to things like excess carbon dioxide, developing ways to synthetically sequester carbon dioxide from the air. A really good example of utilising this innovation is actually Coca-Cola. They announced last year that they're trialling to actually use sequestered CO2 to make their plastic bottles, for example. So real areas of rapid innovation around this. And those sort of emerging technologies mean that we've got those real, viable, genuine alternatives to those sort of business as usual standard approaches that we had. So it's really making us think about this more. We've actually got things that we can do. So the focus is growing in that respect. So what does that have to do with our businesses? Now, we've seen that it's a data-led initiative. We know it's high on the agenda of a number of firms. Some, that's because they are mandated to be interested in this area. They're having to report, they're having to make ESG or at least climate-related disclosures. But there's also a number of businesses that are actually voluntarily aligning themselves in this space. And there's a number of benefits and challenges, but what we're going to do for the purposes of today, we're going to look at least some of the benefits of this. Now, a big one is that mitigated risk and that increased resilience to these ESG related risks. So strong ESG practices are ultimately deemed to make for better business. There's a number of sort of studies, a number of reports that are showing that businesses that are aligning themselves with ESG are actually making sure that they're more resilient for the future. They are becoming more sustainable businesses. Now, from that point of view, that means they're seen as carrying less risk. And for investors in particular, it's aligning more with their interests. As we know, ESG is, of course, investor-led. That's where it came from. There's a lot of attention in this space. It's also being deemed as giving firms a competitive advantage. It's building loyal customer bases. Reputation, we know, is one of the business's most significant and valuable assets. ESG is being increasingly considered as fundamental to a business's reputation, adding significant value to how the brand is perceived, both internally and externally. But this, of course, means having to live up to any sort of values that are shown, any sort of commitments, any pledges, net zero targets, for example, and making sure there isn't any greenwashing, as no business wants to be seen as having any sort of social or environmental blunders, because we know that this does have impact on the bottom line they're losing market share, losing share value in these instances. And if you think back to that increased awareness, we are exposed to that information more than we used to be. Those things that used to be on the news for, say, a day or two are now online on social media for a long time after. So actually getting ESG right, showing commitment there as being a really positive builder of that sort of brand and reputation around businesses. When it comes to talent, also, it's being seen as helpful for attracting and retaining talent. If we think about those S factors, so having that culture, that environment where workers actually feel valued, their development is being prioritised, they've got a good work-life balance, making sure that they're actually being valued. A lot of businesses claim that the people are at the heart of what they do. The S in ESG demands that they prove it. And if we think back to the Great Resignation of 2022, negative culture, lack of well-being, lack of work-life balance were some of the key reasons for people actually moving away from their jobs. So we know how important they are. And we also know that for millennials and Gen Z in particular, companies that align with their values are of increased importance. So they're actually looking for jobs, businesses that actually align with their values on treatment of individuals, treatment of workers, also that sort of environmental ideas as well. So what is their net zero pledges? What are they doing for the environment? Now, another area also when it comes to businesses is we've touched on is that ESG is a data-led initiative. That's what sets it apart from a number of sustainability initiatives that have come before. And any sort of pledges and milestones have to be met or there has to be an explanation as why they haven't been. So we can't really get away with lip service. We can't get away with greenwashing. For example, again, that social media element often calls businesses out on what they're pledging and what they're actually doing if they're achieving those goals. Now, talking about social media again, you may have seen it on Twitter or X as it's now known. There's something that I particularly quite enjoy. There's something called the gender pay bot that every year it comes out during International Women's Day. And every post that a business makes about the women in their organisation, it reposts it saying what their gender pay gap is. So it's almost trolling in a way to show actually this is a reflection of sort of this consideration just on that one aspect of the S factors there. So it's worth looking out for that gender pay bot. Now, as I've said, a number of businesses are aligning with ESG in one way or another, either voluntarily or a number of businesses are increasingly being mandated to. So being pulled in on some form of reporting requirement or some form of disclosure requirement. Now, we're not going to go into these in any real detail. If we did, we would be here for much more than the allotted time, but these are just a handful of some of the directives that are either out there or are coming in the next sort of up and coming months. Just to pull out a couple of real sort of relevance and importance, we've got things like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so the TCFD. I would imagine most of us are aware of this one. It's the one that's spoken about a lot. It's been in place since September 2021. Certain regulated firms in the UK are required to make those TCFD aligned disclosures as an expansion of the Companies Act 2006. And sorry, just to correct myself there, the TCFD itself has been around since around about 2015. It's been aligned under the Companies Act since 2021. And it's all about enhancing transparency in reporting. So it's actually mandatory now for around 1,500 large UK firms, and that number will continue to grow. There's also the TNFD that people may be less aware of. That's the nature-related financial disclosures. So talking about the nature crises that is going hand in hand with the climate crisis. So it works in exactly the same way, but it's actually looking at the impacts from the more natural point of view, not just climate related. And another one of real relevance just before we move on to the next slide is that final one there. Now, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or if you love an acronym, CSDDD. Now, this is a European directive, but it does still have a lot of relevance for us in the UK. So if you're a business that is obviously operating in the EU, you may be pulled into scope. It is currently quite large firms pulled into scope. But this particular directive is very concentrated on the due diligence efforts of businesses around human rights, around environmental impacts across their operations, their subsidiaries, and also their business partners. So anybody within their supply or value chain. And it's all about enhancing those global and EU environmental and human rights protections. Now, the reason that this has implications for the UK, aside from businesses that are still operating in the EU, is that any business that then sits in the supply or value chains of those firms will find themselves suddenly under scrutiny of those businesses as they have to start asking questions of what are you doing in this space? What's your efforts for ESG, for example? So even not being mandated individually, it's that trickle-down impact that is actually pulling in a lot of firms, particularly SMEs, which at the moment seem to be a little bit out of scope for a lot of those mandatory reporting requirements. So a really interesting piece of regulational directive there. And what's also, not to go into too much detail on this particular one, but what's really interesting is it's the first piece of directive sort of within the ESG space that isn't comply or explain. It's actually comply or pay. So those big businesses are making sure that they're getting ready for this regulation coming in, sort of roll out by sort of end of year into 2025. So businesses are starting to adjust here. So you may find if you do work with any businesses in the EU, you'll find that trickle down effect. They may start asking questions about your own ESG endeavours. Now, I touched upon the S factor, those people that are relevant when it comes to the ESG, but they're also relevant to the wider initiative itself. So the actual wider ESG. Stakeholders are incredibly important in this space, particularly in a business's own endeavours. Now, the issues and risks and opportunities that are relevant to a business are determined by both their operating activity and also the concerns of their stakeholders. So there's a real need to understand how each stakeholder considers or engages with those topics that sit within the E, S and G. And it's a really important part of identifying what the most important ESG issues, risks and opportunities actually are for a firm in question. So we've already touched on the investors and shareholders. So incorporating ESG into investment decisions, into portfolio construction, due to that link between ESG performance and increasing sort of financial success, some investors are now creating those sort of formal ESG targets, which is impacting that equity inclusion. Talking about employees as well, they're also directly impacted by an organisation's ESG performance, particularly those S factors, those social aspects concerning the treatment of workers, employee well-being. They're seeking, as I've said, those ESG aligned employers, and it's affecting recruitment as people are looking for those sort of value aligned jobs. Customers as well, we're seeing that they are increasingly making sustainable buying choices. A number of individuals are willing to pay a higher price for eco-friendly products. We do have to bear in mind that we are still, also, of course, in that cost of living crisis. There are a number of customers that wish that they could be buying these more sustainable products, for example, but unfortunately there does tend to be a bit of an increase in price to be that bit more sustainable. Not always, but we do find that that is a bit of a theme. But as more and more businesses adopt to these practices, that's going to sort of settle itself down. But customers also just want to make sure that the businesses that they're spending their money with are actually trying to make a difference themselves also. We touched on community, so reducing any sort of negative impacts and actually looking at benefiting those local communities in which a business operates. Now, this is important for all businesses. It is a consideration for all businesses when it comes to ESG, but of course has certain relevance for certain industries. If we're looking at extraction, for example, or also infrastructure sectors. So actually looking at what the impact of any of their activity could actually be having to the local community in which that will occur. We've touched on suppliers. They are absolutely key to achieving ESG goals, especially when it comes to those environmental and social impacts within the supply or value chain. So actually looking at the adaptability of those suppliers, at any challenges that they face. We can see that sometimes business relationships are ending due to values not aligning or suppliers not being willing to adapt how they operate in order to comply with, say, a larger business's demands or needs when it comes to their ESG endeavours. But most firms we're finding are actually really supporting those that are within their supply and value chain and actually showing that making a difference with just those businesses that are within their chains can actually have a wider knock-on effect, a wider societal knock-on effect. So actually supporting, for example, a business that may be based somewhere that doesn't have the best track record for, say, labour rights or human rights, and actually adjusting things to have that knock-on, potentially domino effect, the more businesses are actually putting into play these ideas, these changes, and offering that support, whether it just be guidance or even some sort of financial support. We're seeing both of those things happening in this space. And of course, that important one for most industries and of course of very much relevance to us, regulators. They are increasingly setting operational and reporting requirements that are including ESG criteria. A lot of focus again is being put in the E space, so a lot of focus on climate, but there is also that incorporation of the ESG on the whole. And we do know that it is very important when we're talking about the FCA. It's very much on their radar and we will see this as we proceed. Now, I'm not going to go in any real detail on this particular slide, but I just want to re-emphasize that point around employees. Now, when it comes to a business trying to adapt ESG initiatives to see how they can be operating, it's really worth emphasizing that ESG isn't just a framework. It is not just a policy. It is actually something that needs to be lived. It is a living initiative. It depends on a company's culture aligning with its claims, which means that everyone in the business needs to have input and involvement. So that pulls in our employees at absolutely all levels. So just top level, it can look at things like these three areas that have appeared on your screen, making sure that that all employees within a firm actually know what they could be doing in this space to help the company to actually reach its top level strategic targets and goals when it comes to the ESG initiatives. So it's about that commitment from everyone, and how that does get communicated is through an ESG policy and also incorporating ESG into the wider objectives for employees. So actually having an ESG related objective as part of, say, their assessment criteria for their one-to-one reviews, things of that nature. So as I said, not going into these in any real detail, just making aware that it isn't just about those top-level strategic decisions. It's actually permeating everything throughout business as usual to make sure that we are actually living these new changes. So that ESG initiative doesn't sit alongside what we do. It permeates and is embedded in what we're doing as a business. So, moving on then to why this is of relevance to insurance. what does this have to do with the sector? And it has an awful lot to do with financial services on the whole. And there is a reason for this. So back in June 2019, the UK government of the time committed the UK to net zero emissions by 2050. At the same time, they also pledged that the UK financial services would be the greenest in the world. Now, we've had a few changes in government since 2019. We've, of course, got a whole new government now following the election. There's been a lot of to and fro. There's been a lot of pushing some of our pledges, some of our commitments back. But those two particular ones that I said there haven't been moved. We're still looking at that 2050 target. Financial services are still being seen as the way to get the whole country there. Now, this puts a lot of pressure on the regulators when it comes to ESG integration. So when it comes to the FCA in particular, we know that they've got an ESG strategy. It's all about supporting the financial sector and driving positive change. And they know that there needs to be a strong regulatory foundation for the financial services to do this. So they're looking at enhancing climate-related financial disclosures, addressing those sustainable labelling, as sustainable labels, and also greenwashing. This is where our anti-greenwashing rule has come from. Also promoting those global standards for sustainability reporting, because one of the concerns that a number of firms have is there's a lack of consistency currently when it comes to the reporting requirements and standards for ESG, and that also depends on what investor's looking at you, what rating agency is looking at you, what framework you're using. So they're trying to pull together what should be consistent for the UK financial services. One of the ways they're doing this is through discussion, through actually working with the industry. An example of this is in their discussion paper, the DP23-1. This was called Finance for Positive Sustainable Change, in which they were looking at how firms are handling the governance, sort of remuneration ideas, incentives, and training when it comes to the sustainable transition. So actually putting ESG initiatives into practice in their firms. So how are they currently shaping their strategies? How are they embedding those practices? So getting feedback from those, really looking at that culture to actually support sustainable change. What are businesses doing? Could this be something that they put forward as guidance for the whole of the industry? Now, it's worth noting that they have stressed a few times that they do not want to make specific ESG rules and regulations for the whole of the financial services. They are expecting firms to govern themselves, so self-governance when it comes to ESG. But there will be existing rules that they think will be very supportive of this. So SM&CR comes into play, that insurance of accountability for conduct and competence, consumer duty, that focus on the prevention of harm, also that protection of market integrity, and product governance comes into play as well with that, again, anti-greenwashing rule, making sure nothing's being said it's a green service, it's a green product, when there is absolutely no evidence to show that it is. One thing as well that they're really looking at is whether there is a need for qualification, whether there is a need for a level of competency. Could there even be need for an SMF when it comes to, in particular, things like those climate-related risks? So actually having the right knowledge, the right skills, do they have to make that a competence requirement? Now, we should be getting the response from this paper in particular by the end of the year. I have been informed that they were absolutely inundated with responses to this particular discussion paper. And that is just reflective of the fact that businesses want to be getting this right. They want the guidance, and the regulator are aware of this, but we just need to watch this space to see what sort of standards, what sort of guidance is coming through. But point there is to emphasize it is very high on the regulator's agenda. Now, at the very beginning of this session, I said that insurance has a unique relationship with ESG. And this is because when it comes to the industry, particularly our insurers and reinsurers, they play a very unique role in considering and addressing ESG matters. So those factors that sit within the E, S and G. And this is because insurance serves as society's risk manager, identifying concerns, influencing change to manage those risks effectively. They do this through their roles as investors of large capital, with the ability to make a significant contribution to tackling ESG challenges via things like sustainable investing. So that could be into renewable energy or sustainable startups, for example. We have seen some businesses trying to pull themselves away from what they consider dirty industry now, so things like non-renewable energy, but that in itself has its own sort of risks, the transitional risks of moving away from these industries. And another element that I like to call the insurance industry the original influencers before that word was taken over by social media is through the underwriting and advisory functions. So actually helping encourage positive actions and behaviour, encourage sustainable actions and behaviours within policy holders, for example. And we're going to go through them really briefly how they can do so. And this is because ESG offers a number of both challenges and opportunities when it comes to, in particular, sort of general insurance. So part of that relationship is those challenges and opportunities that are provided to the industry. So this includes things like climate change and tackling net zero. There's a need to adapt when it comes to covering risk in a changing world, actually understanding what on earth we're talking about when we say net zero and how we can actually reach it, and also support, say, commercial clients in doing the same. And also when it comes to that, being leaders in change, actually seeing how we can influence and embrace that change, as there's real opportunity to do so. So this includes things like identifying new commercial opportunities while actually addressing challenges. So a number of firms are creating what we would call greener products, greener practices. So they're focusing on underwriting for sustainable alternatives as well as sustainable outcomes. So this could be setting requirements for sustainable behaviours from clients. It could be incentivising sustainable practices and sustainable material usage, for example. So that could be through premium discounts, just as an example there. If we're looking at the claims process, really promoting that repair over replacement, creating a circular economy. So there's a real emphasis at the moment within car insurance of those green circular economies, so green parts initiatives. So instead of going for brand new parts, say for a repair, actually we're going through recycled, reused parts instead. So creating that circular economy, avoiding the emissions that come from creating or manufacturing that new part, just as an example. It's also an emphasis on building back better, so using more sustainable materials in, say, a property claim to help build back better there. There's also implications of opportunity and challenge when it comes to the social element. So we're looking at things like underserved populations, looking at emerging risk around this. A particular relevance is building trust. We know that that's a significant challenge. It's a significant challenge for the whole of the financial services, and it is also, and the insurance industry is well and truly a part of that. And there's impacts of those low trusts. Trust levels when it comes to customers, it's creating protection gaps, and we're finding that we're getting those economic losses because individuals either don't have the cover they need, don't have any cover at all, or are paring down their cover and then finding actually they've got losses occurring from this. If we think about again those more frequent, more severe weather events, for example, and then the protection gap, we're finding a lot of those sort of economic losses occurring that are not covered just, for example, and that's a sort of a global picture. So there's a real need to reevaluate our traditional products. Are they still fit for purpose? Do we need something new? How much further can we go when it comes to a green product or service in the insurance industry without pricing people out? Do we need to adapt our understanding of these risks because they're coming at us in sort of a different way? Do we need to reevaluate how we review them? Are we relying too much on what could be considered now outdated risk factors, for example, are questions that we should be asking. And then, of course, just in that social element, also things like diversity, inclusion and culture, we know are areas that need improvement within the industry. So making sure we're fostering those cultures in our own businesses, but also looking at investing in those stakeholder relationships, bridging those access and coverage gaps, engaging with our underserved populations to understand their needs and requirements. Could there even be new products we can develop around this, new criteria, and really helping that sort of education, financial literacy piece when we're engaging in particular with our customers. And then finally there we've got that transparency, integrity, and just operating ethically. Again, we know a lot about governance within the industry, particularly our typical types, so financial crime, data protection, ABC and AML, but looking at those sort of other areas that we may be a bit more uncomfortable with. So ESG, the G in ESG focuses on areas like tax transparency, so transparency around tax strategy, ethical taxation, considerations related to pay gaps, so executive pay, how that differs from those sort of on the shop floor, looking at those pay gaps as well. And it's not just gender pay gaps. We're seeing an increasing look at ethical pay gaps, sexuality pay gaps, and also disability pay gaps, as they can be a really good sort of eye-opener when it comes to wider D&I in particular considerations within a business's culture. So it is all about setting that tone from the top for ethical practices and staff expectations. And it's about focusing on the why rather than just the what. So really emphasizing why there's this need for transparency, increased integrity, and that ethical operation. And of course, it's not just about thinking of this all externally. Firms need to be embedding and living these sort of initiatives as well themselves. So embedding ESG into their own businesses, into their own operations, which of course pulls in a lot of what we've covered previous in the session today. But really worth emphasizing here that it is about progression and not perfection. It's about this transition to being more sustainable, being more ethical, being more transparent. We're not all going to nail this. No business is going to get everything absolutely right every single time, but it's about pushing towards this sustainable transition. What can we do? What's of relevance to our business? What's of relevance to our stakeholder? For insurance firms, what can we influence? What can we be leaders in change around? And of course, that old phrase of those in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, so making sure that we are living this within our own operations also. So before we get to the Q&A and I completely lose my voice, let's just do some summaries and key takeaways from what has been sort of an intro to ESG and its relevance to the insurance industry. So it's really worth noting ESG is a continuously evolving and adapting landscape. But what's worth noting is that it is here to stay. It isn't a passing fad. It may well be in 5 years' time we no longer refer to it as ESG, but at its core, that sustainability transition will stay here. We can't get away from that. There's too many things that need to be rectified. Biggest one being climate crisis. And changes need to be made. So it's not going anywhere. It's going to continue to gain traction. And as I've said, it is trickling down from those larger firms to smaller businesses also. It is very much also going to become just the new norm, the minimum expectation for organisation. And this is because the governmental commitments to that 1.5 degrees, to that net zero by 2050 relies on businesses, and absolutely all businesses, to achieve it. So it pulls in, again, those SMEs. And these factors are just going to continue to influence how we operate, how we do business. Pulling back to one of the first slides as well, making sure, even though we talk about it as the E, S and G, we do not have a siloed approach when we come to ESG. All of these elements work together. They do not work in isolation. So making sure that this is permeating the whole of a business, the whole of the strategy, and we're not just looking at, well, we're just going to focus on climate change and then we'll see what we can do about the rest, because we'll find actually we need that input from all of those elements as well. So getting them all right means we will be more effective, make more of a difference, even if it's more of a sort of a long-term approach that way. That's what we're after. We're after sustainable business. Now, regardless of where a business is in their ESG stages, in their ESG endeavours, it's absolutely important and fundamental that we have an understanding of what it is we're talking about. So sessions like this, where we're looking at that fundamental, very top level intro to what ESG is, why it's relevant, incredibly important, and everybody in a business needs to have an understanding to make sure that we can actually start achieving these goals, start doing our materiality assessments, which is what we use to see what's of importance to our business, where we can make a difference, and really sort of emphasising all those elements that we've come across today around social development, that corporate responsibility, and those ethical business practices. So I'm sure you're pleased to hear that is enough from me talking at you about this product, just to this particular topic. Just to remind you again of your objectives, so you should now be able to explain what ESG is and how it's evolved, be able to identify and describe those key ESG factors and concepts, explain why ESG is important, and also summarise that unique position and relationship that ESG has with the insurance industry. So, do we have any questions?
We do, Karis, we do have one. So just on this, we have a CSR policy which covers these topics. Is it just a case of renaming it now?
No. So corporate social responsibility, so CSR, is pretty much, it's considered to be the stepping stone from where ESG came from. Now, it does cover a lot of what we've covered. It definitely does. The difference is, it depends on how you've been utilising it, but CSR was sort of self-regulation. ESG isn't. It's that data-led initiative. So it's making sure it's consistent with those external standards, because they're just they're at a higher level. So very similar, but it is different. So it isn't the case at all of just changing the name. It is completely sort of reassessing, doing that materiality assessment from the point of view of an ESG framework.
Great, thanks, Karis. And we've got no other questions, and we're just about out of time. So I'll wrap it up there, if that's all right with you. So just remains for me to say thanks so much, Karis, for your presentation today, which I'm sure everyone will agree, and I've seen a couple of the comments, has been really valuable. So thank you for that. You can reach Karis at on the next slide. We'll have Karis's contact details. Yep, you can reach Karis on the details shown, or alternatively, feel free to contact me at tim.richards@mgaa.co.uk with any questions or introductions, and I'll be happy to pass these on. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Hope you've enjoyed the session, and I hope you have a productive afternoon. So thanks, everyone, and thanks once again, Karis.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.